Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a curious game in the franchise for various reasons. For starters, it was the last game in the original RE trilogy, concluding the Raccoon City storyline that began in the first game. It was the first game to bring back an already established character, Jill Valentine, as protagonist, and it introduced several interesting additions to the classic RE formula that would return in future entries. This game also developed ideas from RE2 to various degrees of success, and it was the only game in the franchise to do a few things like branching paths on a fully explorable Raccoon City. Most fans disregard this game like the lesser of the trilogy, a spin-off of a game that was slammed with the RE3 title to cash grab on the success of RE2. Its greatest defenders, on the other hand, will say that this is in fact the best in the trilogy and that it was always intended to be a mainline entry. Which side is right and which side is wrong is really not the point of this video. There are some aspects of one side that I agree with and aspects of the other side that I agree as well. So more than defending the program or trying to prove one point over the other, what I want to do with this video is lay out my impressions and journey regarding this game, what I liked, what I didn't, and where I think it stayed from reaching the heights of RE1 and 2. It's about time we begin. So sit back, grab your Valentine sweets and relax, because we're going to go deep on this one. All Resident Evil games that I've played so far have delivered strong opening sequences, and RE3 is not the exception. Taking place parallel to the events of RE2, the third installment also begins during the outbreak. Zombies are everywhere, devouring everything they find. The police officers, the militia, even the mercenaries sent by Umbrella to hold off the attack are not enough to contain the hordes of thousands that have suddenly turned into raving, flesh-eating monsters. Within the thick of it is Jill Valentine, trying to survive. This is where the game finally gives you control of the character, and you're presented to the classic RE gameplay of combat, evasion, and resource management. You have to survive the initial waves of zombies before quickly finding momentary respite within a warehouse where a traumatized man is locking himself within a truck cart because he would rather die of starvation than being eaten by those monsters. This is where the action cools down and the eerie atmosphere begins. Because now we are walking through the streets of Raccoon City, grown eerily quiet after the undead hordes have claimed their victory. The sound of their groans and footsteps echoing down the alleys, broken once in a while by the death cries of remaining humans. But things will not remain quiet for long, because soon after, you will be presented to the Nemesis, an Umbrella mutation that dwarfs the Tyrant of the first game and the T-100 of the second in terms of strength, speed, and being an overall nuisance. This creature is programmed with one mission in mind: destroy all remaining STARS agents. So now, not only do you have to survive the zombies and other mutations lurking around the streets, but now you have to survive the Nemesis, who actually follows you through the different maps in both scripted sequences and what I believe were randomized encounters. Not all is doom and gloom in this city, however. You will eventually encounter other survivors, Umbrella mercenaries who are developing a plan for escape, and you will have to learn to trust them in order to stay alive. Different to the previous games, RE3 permits you to fully explore Raccoon City, which was only referenced to in RE1 and 0, and we only saw a few portions of it briefly during the second game. Now, we get to explore it, with all the Metroidvania survival horror trappings we've come to expect from this franchise. The map design is even more ambitious in this game, with wide cinematic vistas depicting the tall buildings and winding streets which lead to an overall larger map that change more frequently as the story develops, creating new threats, both large and small, and revealing secret areas you at first couldn't find by yourself. As a result, the world in this game feels more dynamic and alive than it already did in previous games. You will often encounter with situations like hearing a man or a woman scream. Shortly after, you see him or her running from zombies, and if you follow this encounter, you will eventually see their fallen form on an alley. New and different enemies will respawn in this game with more frequency than they did in the previous games. But more than that, the enemy types will change within various playthroughs and reloads. At one point, after going to and fro the clock gate various times, a group of crows emerged from a ransacked store, invading the area and making it harder for me to return to this map in the future. After a reload, it wasn't crows, but dogs, which I find even nastier than the crows because they get in my way more easily. Aside of respawning monsters in chalk fight scenes, the game also changes areas by introducing environmental hazards, like crumbling floors that trap you in sewer tunnels with slimy enemies, or entire areas that explode once you finish certain objectives, locking you out of any loot you had still to collect. There are some points in which the game gives you two options to choose from that will offer slightly different solutions to the same problems, giving you access or not to story moments, lore, loot, and even quest items. Moments like when the Nemesis finds you in a restaurant, in which you can try to escape through the trapdoor or hide in the kitchen, and depending on what you choose, two different conclusions will happen and Carlos will react differently.
Are you crazy? You could have barbecued both of us!
The same Carlos is a character that you can, in fact, meet within two entirely different places with different dialogues and outcomes depending on which building of the city you explored first. This way, there will be dialogues and secret areas throughout the game that you will not be able to see during a playthrough, because doing one automatically cancels the other. Simply said, you cannot meet Carlos twice in a playthrough. This was both good and bad for me. Good in seeing and admiring how the game devs, 3 games later, still found ways of innovating and refreshing the experience, but also bad after having systematically explored all rooms in all the other games and realizing that some rooms in this third game's map would remain uncleared. But this is just me being a little whimsical, nothing important. A bigger problem arose, in my opinion, with the decision of spawning enemies at random in certain areas of the city. The positive to this is that the game always maintains a level of unpredictability because you are never really sure of what will the game come up with as you enter a new area or return to previously explored areas. The downside is that randomization reduces significantly the advantage a player earns through experience. In previous RE games, you had a significant advantage during second or third playthroughs because you could anticipate the upcoming hurdles and prepare accordingly. However, this is not so possible in RE3 because in one try you encounter serpents and in the next you encounter hunters. Yes, hunters are back and they are meaner than ever. Some of these enemies are simply more dangerous than others, and some players will find it harder to fight or avoid one more than the other, and so, if you die at the hands of the hunters and have to reload, you can't prepare yourself for a hunter fight because this next time the game might place dogs instead or nothing at all. So you brought weapons and healing items for a fight that didn't occur, and now you have your inventory full. This lack of consistency is too volatile for my taste. Even if the initial impression when realizing the game changes each time you reload is good, because it opens the door for scary unpredictability, on the long run, once the initial impression is gone, and you have died and reloaded 100 times, you realize that this decision is not the best for the game and it can even become outright annoying. I'll say one good other thing about the randomization though, and that is that it works better on puzzles than it does on combat encounters. Some puzzles will change solutions, like those that require you to write down numbers or passwords. This, I felt, is better for the experience than randomized enemies, because they force you to always look out for clues during second playthroughs instead of going through the motions. You have to be aware of the differences because if not, you will write down the same number or password. and get no results this second time around because the answer has changed. In terms of mechanics, some of them have returned and others have changed, for both good and ill. One big new addition that I am happy to report is in this new game is that Capcom finally broke the code on making us climb stairs without having to press the action button. For the first time in the series, we could climb stairs by just pressing forward or, most importantly, backwards. So that means that we can climb while retreating from enemies instead of getting stuck at the base of the stairs as it would so often happen in the previous two games. Hard to believe, just watch. This might seem insignificant, but these little details can make the difference between life and death in this type of game, so thumbs up for that. Another great addition is that we, for the first time in the series, can do a 180-degree spin by just pressing the run button and then moving backwards. This is another game changer that helps a lot in this game due to its many combat and boss encounters, allowing you to quickly turn and run away from enemies when in previous games you would have to slowly turn all the way around to escape. So yes, another thumbs up for that. Now comes a thumbs down for a returning mechanic that I didn't like. That returning mechanic that I wasn't happy with is the auto-aim. Auto-aim was removed in the second game, which initially made the game harder because you had no way of detecting enemies off camera. However, it also gave you full control of where you were shooting and why. Resident Evil 3 brings auto-aim back, and for as good as it is being able to pinpoint enemies from a distance again, I wasn't entirely happy with the return because now I would have Jill pointing at the nearest enemy, which isn't always the one I want to shoot first. Maybe the nearest zombie is one that is already broken on the ground, thus representing less immediate danger than one's upright but still slightly away, and in prioritizing that one over the others, Jill ends up turning her back at the real threat, and in the time it takes to slowly turn her back to the enemies I want her to shoot, she gets grabbed, injured, or possibly killed. Auto-aim grows particularly annoying and hindering during the later stages when fighting precarious boss encounters that require you to precisely shoot at objects instead of the enemy itself. This becomes even more complicated now because the game added a secondary aim button that targets explosive objects. This on premise is a great idea. Within the right situation, you can quickly target a gasoline tank or pressure pipe and eliminate all or most threats in the area. But when you have various explodable objects in near proximity, it can be a little hard, within the heat of battle, to find the one you need to explode first. So yes, auto-aim in all forms was an addition that I received both positively and negatively. It can complicate aiming with intense situations, but it helps you eliminate large quantities of enemies this game can spawn at you without wasting too many bullets, and when you land that perfect shot and blow all zombies and monsters sky high, it feels so satisfying. Another cool addition to the gameplay of classic Resident Evil is the dodge mechanic. If you press aim and fire at the right time, Jill can dodge enemy attacks and push enemies off her, opening a path for you to escape if needed. This mechanic works automatically and very well when using automatic guns and all types of firearms with enough ammo to spam, because Jill, or Carlos during his section of the game, will dodge attacks and keep on firing. This system won't dodge all types of attacks, so repositioning is still relevant here, but it helps with basic attacks from most enemies. It is very useful when fighting fast enemies like wolves and hunters, and it is also very useful during some boss fights. I wish the dodge had its own button, so as to make it more precise and thus its use more skill-based instead of relying so much on chance as it is. Because I am firing, I'm shooting at enemies, and sometimes the character dodges. With its own button, I know when I am attacking and when I am dodging, so it's more on me if I time it right or wrong, and of course, the dodge should have had invulnerability frames if timed correctly, because often you can successfully land your dodges and still get hit because you ran out of space or the enemy's hitbox is bigger than your dodge animation. However, When all stars align and you successfully move away from an enemy attack, it is so satisfying. The final notable addition to the franchise is the ability to craft your own bullets. If you find the right type of gunpowder, you can craft from basic bullets all the way to shotguns, magnums, and even grenades of various types. I loved this addition because it gives you another layer of decision making throughout the game, and the only problem that I have with this addition is that the game, due to its survival horror roots, doesn't give you enough resources to fully experiment with the system and gather enough satisfying results. During hard mode, resources are quite scarce, so you will be quite limited. But even during easy, I never found enough gunpowder to craft most types of ammo aside of 9mm bullets and shotgun shells. As a huge fan of tools and gadgets in video games, I wanted to delve deeper into this system and be able to craft fire grenades or ice grenades, but I really couldn't. I understand that this is a horror game, and as such the developers have to be mindful of not overpowering the player with endless gifts. And even if I personally do not mind because I enjoy playing around with my tools, I understand when other players point this out as negative. The two best examples that I can give right now of other games that limit resources during their hardest difficulties and still allow you to use your tools with enough freedom as to be satisfying are Resident Evil 1 Remake, which is one of the most balanced games ever made, and The Last of Us during grounded mode. These games limit resources very much during their hardest difficulties, and you will spend most of the gameplay strategizing, evaluating if I really need to take down this zombie or if I can just move past him, and if I do really need to fight him, will I use a shotgun shell to one-off him, or will I risk losing health by using the knife? These games, within their limited generosity, also motivates you to become better at playing the game, because you learn not only how to avoid enemy attacks, but also how to better use your weapons during those moments that you have to. In The Last of Us, you are incentivized to land headshots with your arrows, because by doing so you reduce the chance of breaking the arrows and lose it forever. You learn to use stealth so as to prevent breaking your weapons during combat and have them for those precarious moments in which an enemy will find you and you are unable to sneak past him. Thus, you press the square button with the security that you have your bladed weapon ready to take him down and prevent him from revealing your position to the other enemies, because you didn't waste your weapon in fights you could have well avoided or dealt with in other, more subtle and economical ways. RE3 has a lot of interesting additions. However, I don't feel like I could appreciate them as much as I could in other games. But to be honest, I have so far been nitpicking details here and there that I did or did not like. However, none of these things broke the game for me. What basically ruined the experience for me is none other than the Nemesis himself, and sadly, in all the wrong ways.
Ya lo hizo. Casa Nemesis. ¿Qué te dije?
No, intentamos otra vez.
Nemesis is not the first stalker enemy of this franchise. Before this one, we had the T-100, also known as Mr. X, who is a freaking menace that will make your life miserable each time he appears. However, Mr. X didn't bother me because he was just one part of the entire RE2 experience. RE2 is one of the most creative, best designed and complete games in the entire franchise. A game that perfectly balances slow-paced dread with pulse-pounding horror. A game that perfectly balanced humor with heart, the quiet, reflective moments with explosive action, puzzles with combat, and as part of all of that, we had the T-100 haunting us and giving the game an ever-present level of dread. Resident Evil 3, on the other hand, builds itself around the idea of the stalker enemy. Nemesis is not a part of RE3. He is RE3 for both good and ill. Because even if the introduction of the character is mysterious and impressive when he appears, that's also part of the problem. The mystery and the dread lasts for too little. All too soon we will have the Nemesis appearing, and once that happens, this guy is going to be on your heels the entire game. I am not joking. This guy is haunting you the entire game. There are parts that are scripted, but other encounters feel more randomized. The guy will sometimes jump right in front of you and completely demolish your plan of action. Fighting him is really not a good idea because he is too strong and at first you lack the proper equipment to do so, forcing you to run for your life instead. This all sounds great on paper, but you already know what I said about randomization in this type of game. A run will go as well or as bad as whatever the game decides to throw at you. If this time it's the Nemesis, then get ready to reload the game and lose 20 minutes of progress. The overpowered nature of this enemy means that he will outshine every other aspect of this game, which is sad, because there are plenty of things this game do right, and you can't appreciate any of them because the Nemesis is always getting in the way. The T-100 was part of the RE2 experience. He complements that game. The Nemesis, on the other hand, hinders and outright crushes the RE3 experience. And for me, that didn't work. Because Resident Evil is not just about being in constant peril of dying and losing your progress. It's also about the atmosphere, the scenery, the mystery, the quiet, beautiful moments, the lingering dread, the fear of the unknown. If you're constantly crushing the atmosphere by throwing real perils at the player, you kind of ruin the survival horror experience. This might sound weird at first, but the best survival horror games are the ones that manage to nail the balance of real peril with the illusion of peril. Too much illusion and you risk falling into the caveats of Thief 3, whose survival horror mission is as effective as you think it is real. The moment you realize it is not, the fear is gone, and the rest of the sequence is just noise. The same thing happened with Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Much of the game loses its impact the moment you realize the peril is faked. But on the other hand, too much peril at too frequent a pace also breaks the survival horror experience. And if the Nemesis encounters had only been about running away from him, I wouldn't have hated the guy as much because running is part of what you do in this type of game. However, there are sections in which the game forces you to fight this guy and beat him, so the story can continue. Mr. X and the Tyrant from the first game were fast and hardy, but Nemesis puts them all to shame. On paper that makes for a pretty formidable opponent, but in practice you realize that this opponent goes way and beyond what the game's mechanics can normally handle. The Tyrant and Mr. X were tough battles, but I never felt they broke the game. I can confidently say the same thing about all the boss encounters of RE1 Remake and even the same Zero's. The problem with Zero's boss fights was that they required too much of hoarding a specific type of ammo to be able to defeat them, but once you had what you needed, the mechanics could sustain the fight pretty well. Nemesis, however, breaks the game, particularly when he grabs you and throws you to the ground. Once you are on the ground, Jill won't stand up until you tell her to. But telling her is not just about pressing the action button once, no, you have to button mash and, additionally, you have to wiggle the left stick up and down. I removed my cap to all the people that had to do this back in the PS2 era with the controllers of the time, because I simply couldn't do it with my modern controller. You have my utmost respect for doing this because there was no way I could do it. Jill wouldn't stand up in time. Nemesis would grab her and this time he automatically kills her, because that is how this fight works. If Nemesis grabs you 2 times in a row, you get instantly killed no matter how much health you have or what difficulty you chose. It's how the fight was designed. So I realized that I had to get up fast enough to avoid that second grab, and the only way I could do it was by using good old keyboard. I never had console machines as a boy. In my household, what we had was a PC, so it was PC games what I grew up playing, and PC games are played with mouse and keyboard. I've started to use controllers in recent years because some games, like fighting games, work better with these devices. I also prefer playing third-person open worlds with controllers because I can slow walk with the left stick, unlike keyboard, in which you only get one set speed with each button press. Mouse and keyboards are better for fast-paced games and first-person shooters that need you to be in constant movement. With controllers I can sit back and relax, which is usually what I need after a long stressful day. However, it is the more stressful nature of the keyboard what actually got me out of this boss encounter with Nemesis midway in the game. I have never been very good at button mashing, usually failing quick-time events that need of that. However, I can button mash better with mouse and keyboard because I have gravity at my side, unlike controllers, which naturally relax your hands more in a laid-back position. I had to relearn the game's controls on keyboard and try the fight a few more times without positive effects, but upon finally being able to lift Jill back to her feet with incessant mashing of the keyboard, I observed that the Nemesis wouldn't one-shot me if I prevented him from grabbing me immediately after the first grab, because standing up between grabs kind of resets the Nemesis moveset, and each time he grabs you it registers as the first grab and not the second. Eventually, I could do it, and I felt so proud of myself. Then came Carlos' big moment in which he braves a monster-infested and booby-trapped hospital in search of a cure to heal Jill Valentine before the Nemesis returns to ruin what is left of the game, blocking me within another boss encounter that required me to shoot some switches to spray some acid on the Nemesis a few times before he falls unconscious. This is another irritating battle because shooting the switches is not easy. Even less when Jill is constantly prioritizing the Nemesis and it takes forever for her to rotate to the switch I need her to shoot, and it only takes milliseconds for the Nemesis to throw one of his tentacles from the other side of the room to suck me lifeless. Other boss fights in Resident Evil games were hard, but I never felt they strayed too far from what the game can normally achieve. Even the Lich Queen at the ending of Zero, a fight I had to try over a dozen times, never fell beyond what the game's mechanics could handle. Nemesis, however, did. These fights are too ambitious for the game that, polishing and new additions aside, is, when all is said and done, the same engine and gameplay style that was introduced all the way back to RE1. For all of these reasons, I found the T-100 way more effective than the Nemesis, because his appearances were less frequent and thus more memorable when they actually happened. He never annoyed me and pulled me out of the game by making me realize the game's mechanics are not sufficiently polished or developed enough to handle the ambition of the encounter. The Nemesis, on the other hand, scared me way less because he is more frequently getting in the way of my progression, at various times blocking me for days with fights that became too difficult in all the wrong ways. I actively hated the character and the character bored me out of the game. When I was playing Resident Evil 2, I was hooked. I wanted to see more of the game, more of the characters, their interconnected campaigns, more puzzles, more boss encounters. I wanted to live the experience at its fullest, and I wasn't thinking about playing any other game at the time. With Resident Evil 3, however, I was constantly thinking about continuing my second Sekiro playthrough that I put on hold to play this specific game. And guess what? I sometimes did. There were nights that I just didn't play Resident Evil 3. I played other games like Sekiro, Berserk, Tomb Raider 1 and 2, Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, hell, Resident Evil 1 Remake, with its grenade zombies and all. A game that I've already played and covered in the channel, and I still wanted to play that game more than RE3. And all of this was because the game was constantly getting me stuck with Nemesis encounters and boss fights that gradually became more and more predictable, less impressive or scary, but more obtuse and ultimately more annoying. Mr. X was a pain in the ass, and I grimaced each time he appeared, but that's the thing, I grimaced in terror, because he never lost momentum for me. With Nemesis, I stopped grimacing by the 5th time he appeared, because the joke was starting to wear thin very fast. By the second boss encounter, I was seriously considering skipping this game and moving on to RE4. This game, simply said, stretches a player's patience too thin. It outplays his hand way too soon, and the saddest thing about this game is that it actually had more and better cards to play with, but the designers decided to make the Nemesis the one true deal of this game. Nevertheless, I powered through the game, and it was mainly due to the encouragement of Big Sister, who sat with me one night to watch me play the Nemesis encounter you're seeing on screen. She said very little, but the times she spoke were words of encouragement. She was rooting for Jill, upset with how violent and abusive the Nemesis is, and before I even realized, I was laughing and actually having a good time. We laughed at the Nemesis who is constantly growling in anger, we laughed at his eloquence, and all of a sudden, he was down. Shortly after, and after one last encounter with the by now broken Nemesis that wasn't really too hard in contrast to everything that came before, the game was over, the Nemesis defeated, and Jill had her most badass moment yet.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
Credit where it's due. If Capcom wanted to make a villain that you love to hate and in the end defeat, they more than succeeded. No villain has pissed me off as much as this guy since the Dahaka many years ago. I also have to give a big thanks to Big Sister. Without her support, I wouldn't have been able to finish this game and thus make this video. Resident Evil 3 also takes place during the fall of Raccoon City, as seen in RE2. Only that this time we are seeing the events through Jill Valentine's point of view, as she is trying to escape the city, being persecuted not only by zombies and other mutations, but by a new creature called the Nemesis, who is programmed to eliminate all remaining STAR agents. Resident Evil 3, like all the other games, starts really strong, packed with action and shock frights, great music and acting that at first sounds better than anything we had before in this franchise.
Okay, we've got to get out of here.
What? What do you think you're talking about? I just lost my daughter out there! How dare you tell me to go back outside?
I'm sorry about your daughter, but there isn't gonna be any rescue. We have to get out of here!
No! I'm not going anywhere! I'd rather starve to death in here than be eaten by one of those undead monsters! Now leave me alone!
When I heard this scene, I thought to myself, wow, they've committed to the voice acting more this time around. It's not perfect, but miles better than anything we had before.
No! Don't go!
Joseph!
However, this momentum will not last forever. The acting will grow increasingly worse and the writing, in my opinion, never hangs together. One of the biggest problems that this game has is that, in part due to the shorter length of this campaign and also due to centralizing the story and the gameplay solely around the character of Nemesis, much of the story of RE3 feels less interesting and meaningful. With a few exceptions here and there, the stakes never grow aside of the fact that Nemesis is after you and he gets angrier in each bout. By now, it's commonplace to have buildings blow behind you, so having a place blow after a countdown is no longer as creative or impactful as it used to be. And since we do nothing but fight the Nemesis throughout the entire game, the lore of Raccoon City and the intrigues of Umbrella and the city's politicians are harder to grasp than they were in RE2. I can tell you that I understood and I still remember the role that Chief Irons was playing in RE2. But I couldn't honestly say that I can remember the role that the mayor of Raccoon City, whose name I can't remember, had in unleashing the zombie outbreak in 3. Another thing that I didn't like about this game is how they overlook the plot points established in RE2. Chris Redfield was trying to find evidence to unmask Umbrella Corporation before the American government because all the evidence they had in the Spencer Mansion was blown sky high at the ending of RE1. So they were basically back to square one. However, Chris was not alone in this investigation. Jill was helping him, and so were Barry, Rebecca, and Brad. This was established in notes that you read in RE2, so the question is, where is the rest of the gang in RE3? Brad had a brief appearance, and I've heard that Buddy appears in one of the endings of the game. But that's still not enough. When did Chris and Jill separate? Why did they separate? And how is it that they aren't keeping acquaintances with one another? How is it that Jill doesn't know or doesn't have a clue on how to find Chris? I think that the STARS members should have been present in this game, considering that the Nemesis is sent to destroy all of them, not just Jill. Even if the characters are separate, even if some of them do not appear in person, they still should have been present more significantly in the game. Maybe Barry talks to you through your walkie-talkie. Maybe you find some notes that Chris left behind in some safe houses with provisions, stuff like that. Details, Capcom, that's all I'm asking. The other RE games aren't brimming with the most detailed writing, but they always had an extra layer of something that other games at the time severely lacked. But okay, the previous games, intrigues aside, details and chronological cohesion aside, stood out for me mainly because of the characters that appear in the game, and so RE3 wouldn't be the exception, right? Well, the thing is that RE3's characters are really the worst so far. It saddens me to say so, but that is the truth. They are not bad, and they have potential, but since the relationship between any of the characters never grow and not much happens to them individually either, then you don't have the strong emotional ties that anchors you to these characters as you had in RE1 and 2, and even the Saint Zero. Like I said, not all is bad in this game. There are some good things, case in point, the character of Jill Valentine. Even if I would have liked more references to her friends, the character of Jill herself is very well done. And I might say this is the best version of Jill so far, and from the looks of what's coming after, ever. An interesting detail to point out is that Jill Valentine is the first RE character to return in the campaign of a sequel game. RE1 and 2 both feature entirely new characters, with the second doing brief mention to the character of the first game, but RE3 became the first to bring back an already established character instead of introducing a new one. That way, the game can cut to the chase sooner because we already know who Jill is, and the fact that we already know and care for this character makes the stakes of the game even higher. Jill in many ways is the best this game has to offer. Her character remains consistent to her first appearance in terms of personality, although this time around she has slightly more edge because she is being pushed to her very limits and thus she is starting to fight back. This is shown mainly through the gameplay by adding new skills that give you a slight advantage in combat. However, this added edge is also noticeable in the way she is written. The character reflecting less tolerance during dire situations because all of them are running out of time and there is simply no room for weaknesses or insolence. Naturally, Jill is the character that carries the emotional weight of the story. Whenever a character is losing his temper and his will to survive, she will quite literally slap him back to his senses, but fortunately, and unlike most modern day characters, Jill is not just about barking and biting, but also about understanding people and bringing the best out of them, pulling them back to their feet and patching their wounds both figuratively and literally. Jill Valentine is the best aspect of this game, and I just wish we had explored her character a little bit more instead of focusing so much on the Nemesis. This is Jill's last mainline game, and the last time we are going to see the character in a long time, and we are wasting her character in a game about an asshole that says "Stars" all the time. Angry complaints aside, the game is what it is, and what it is already good for the character. Resident Evil 3 is also the first game in the franchise to start the long-running tradition of protagonizing its game with a new character alongside a legacy character, a tradition the franchise has carried with few exceptions all the way from RE3 to RE9. Obviously, Jill is the legacy character of this game, while the newly introduced protagonist is Carlos Oliveira. At first, Jill doesn't trust Carlos because he works for Umbrella, but as the game progresses and they help one another, Jill begins to trust and care for Carlos more and more. Despite the fact that he works for Umbrella and that his commander is not a good person, Carlos Oliveira himself is not a bad person. However, his line of work as a mercenary has kept him from being a good person either, and he sees in the zombie outbreak a chance to change that. In many ways, Carlos looks up to Jill, and throughout the entire game he works hard to, using his own words, get good at this hero thing. And even if he suffers doubts and insecurities at some points, he mostly succeeds in becoming a hero, saving Jill's life at various moments and helping her escape the exploding city by the end. Very much like Jill, I would have liked to see more of Carlos and less of the Nemesis. Carlos is a character with a lot of potential that the game barely scratches, and it is mainly due to that stupid Nemesis with his Colgate denture always getting in the way and ruining each and every sequence, each and every time. That way, Carlos is unable to reach the levels of lovability and iconicness as Barry Burton from the first game, and much less the emotional resonance that was attained with Rebecca, Ada, and Sherry. Even if Jill and Carlos make for a pretty spicy ship, the ship itself didn't reach the levels that Rebecca and Billy Cohen's ship reached for me in RE0, because Billy and Becca spend the entire game together, in both cutscenes and gameplay, and when they are forced apart, it feels truly gut-wrenching because they've both come to depend on one another so much. Even in the other games that had no such thing as cooperative gameplay as in Zero, the characters appear more often than Carlos did, and you actually get to fight battles together once in a while. I never fought alongside Carlos at any point, the character always absent or getting unconscious before the real fight begins, and this had its toll on how I felt for the character and the overall story of this game. Resident Evil 3 is a good game, with interesting and creative ideas, a fully explorable Raccoon City, and with Jill Valentine to elevate the game further. I am glad that this game exists, bringing to completion the Raccoon City storyline that started in RE1 and was expanded in RE2. I didn't play these games when they came out. I didn't grow up with them, so they did not form part of my formative years. I don't have the attachment to this story as other players that grew up in Raccoon City have, but still, I would be lying if I said that I felt nothing as I saw Raccoon City being evaporated and thousands of lives destroyed because of Umbrella's greed and irresponsibility. In many ways, these games resembled the stories told by masters like Rod Serling and Richard Matheson, writers that feared and actively warned the world about the dangers of nuclear power. Resident Evil's biohazard twist to the nuclear trope is very prophetic of the times we are living now, and the whole bombing scene at the end of the third game is a nod to the writers and the stories that came before, many of which inspired this one. The game also gives tribute to its prior two games in ways that felt poetic and full circle. One of these moments is, of course, the RPD sequence. Visiting the RPD with Jill after having explored this place so deeply in RE2 was one of my favorite moments in the game. The place where Jill worked, where most of her friends worked, now abandoned, a broken stamp of a past life never to return. Another great moment was the final confrontation with Nemesis. This confrontation is so poetic because it takes place in one of Umbrella's biochemical dumpsters. You can see the carcasses of other tyrants like the one you fought in RE1, and even the carcass of a Mr. X, the stalker enemy of RE2, and it is so fitting that the all-powerful Nemesis dies in a place like this, broken, humiliated. He dies the same way he was created, like just another piece of toxic waste. So yes, Resident Evil 3 is a good game and a necessary game within the franchise's continuity. However, it also has the most underwhelming NPCs so far in the series. It suffers of underused systems, mechanics that make the experience clunkier instead of fluid, a randomized system that transforms the game more into a test of luck than a true survival horror experience, and of course the overused nemesis that wore thin all too quickly. For as good, important and poetic as this game is, I couldn't help but feel that this game had so much more potential that wasn't fulfilled. For as good as it is to have Jill back, so little happens with her. We learn nothing about her, we hear nothing of Barry, and the only mention of Chris is a few words at the epilogue. Nemesis is hunting down all STARS members, but none of these characters are present or even mentioned in the game. The RPD sequence was great and one of my favorite parts of the game, but Jill doesn't even mutter a word of recognition, and of course, the Nemesis will break in all too soon and ruin the moment. I am not asking for this game to have Naughty Dog's levels of writing, but a few well-placed words, a few more scenes that allow me to reflect and feel the weight of what is happening. These few things would have made the difference. Because the first two games weren't bulging with detailed writing and character exposition, but they certainly had a little bit more, and enough to make the difference. This is part of what I've liked about this franchise, that it has a little bit more than most other games of the time. When you compare the NPCs of Resident Evil to other NPCs like Cedric from King's Quest V, and yes, I'm going to start poking at you again, King Graham. The Resident Evil NPCs win by a mile in terms of story presence, likability, and helpfulness. Yes, they are all NPCs of 1990s puzzle games, so they will say and do very little, but they stood out because they did and said a little bit more than their competitors. Carlos Oliveira felt lacking when compared to Barry and Rebecca. Jill's character arc felt lacking when compared to Claire's and Leon's from the previous game. And the thing that bugged me the most about this game is that, upon doing research for this video, I learned that the game has epilogues for all the other characters aside of Jill. But in order for you to unlock these epilogues, you would have to finish the game 7 more times. An epilogue for Chris, an epilogue for Claire, one for Barry, another for Leon, Sherry, Ada, even Hunk. And while we're at this, they might as well have added something for Rebecca and this game's new addition, Carlos, but that meant playing the game 10 times and not 8, which is too much. And replaying the game is not the problem. These games are pretty short and fun. The problem is that I have to face Nemesis again, which means getting stuck again within all the obtuse parts that I could barely finish the first time, and right now, I don't have the time and the energy to do that. I don't discard the possibility of replaying this game in the future, but for the purpose of this playthrough and this video, I had my fill. I just wish I could have enjoyed the upsides more, because Resident Evil 3 is the conclusion to the original trilogy and I felt the excitement, mystery, intrigue, and the drama more in the previous two games than I did here. And the common denominator to all of these issues is the overuse of the Nemesis character and how his constant presence prevents the rest of the game from fulfilling its potential. I understand that this is the favorite game of several fans out there, that they even like it more than RE2. I know that this game filled an important role in many players' formative years, that Jill's story, her guts and her unwavering determination to survive and overcome any obstacle inspired a generation of young people back in the 1990s. I've heard them, and I respect them, believe me, I do. I love this franchise and I want to love it even more, but for all the reasons that I've explained for long enough here, I, personally, didn't have the best experience. Most nights were spent hitting my head against the wall, tired of retrying the same boss encounters again and again, often considering leaving the game unfinished and all. No game is perfect. Nothing ever is. But in this case, I felt like the negatives far outweighed the positives, thus making Resident Evil 3 my least favorite game in the franchise so far, and the perfect warning sign that this franchise was starting to need more than just stalker enemies dragging the rest of the experience down. It needed better writing, more creativity, more depth in design rather than randomization, and a newer engine better designed for the ambition of the developers, which was fast outgrowing their current engine. Resident Evil was starting to show its age, and it needed an evolution. maybe it was time for two games to happen. Resident Evil 1 Remake, which is the pinnacle of classic RE gameplay, and the other game that had to exist to immortalize the franchise is, of course, Resident Evil 4, the evolution I am talking about, but that is a story for another video. Like and subscribe so you don't miss that one when it comes out. And in the meantime, you might want to check my review on RE2, which in my humble opinion is a miles better game than 3. Hope you enjoy it. Have a great rest of your day and or night, and as always, stay safe.